All the way from the start, I can feel it in my heart, like all the way from the start.
That's where compression comes in. It can be very handy. It can also, give you the power to put things more up front and have them with that consistency by heavily compressing and then just bringing up the level of a track. Next up, we're talking about reverb for creating space and separation in your mixes. And there's a lot of stuff to unpack with this as well. But the basic premise is that if you create a bigger reverb space, say longer decay, maybe less of a pre-delay, bigger size, then that's going to give whatever element we have this on the perspective to the listener that it is further back in the mix in terms of the sound stage, right? So if you have a smaller reverb, maybe you have no reverb at all, that's going to give the listener more of a perspective that that's, right in front of them, right? So that's one side of this. But the other side of it is that we can use reverb to actually blend and create some cohesion between different elements. So we give it a sense of space, but it's more of like a vibey space that works together. Let me play this snare in my bridge section real quick without this reverb, and then I'm going to turn it on and we're going to talk about what is going on and why I did this. And with... Okay, so just to be clear, I don't want to confuse you because I utilized a pre-delay, which is a trick here because we can actually give the perspective to the listener more that snare is still up front, but we're utilizing the tail of that reverb to create that space and that vibe. And what that does is it better blends the snare with the pad that's going along with it, that big washy pad. So I'm using that reverb to create a focal point, but something that is more cohesive in terms of those elements working together. All right, so another huge, very important aspect of creating space and separation in your mixes is to utilize the entire stereo field. So there's a couple of different points that we want to touch on with this. The first one, very basic one, is panning. So again, you're going to look and see that I have a lot of these elements panned, and panning is a very powerful way to create focal points like we've been talking about. So if you wide pan something and then there's nothing else in the mix wide pan, you're going to notice that you have directed yourself or the listener to focus on that throughout the entire mix. Seems pretty obvious, right? But that's just to demonstrate the power of panning. The thing you want to consider with this is that you want to, once again, balance the panning. So a lot of times, if I'm wide panning things, I wide pan them in pairs, so that we're not creating as much of a distraction. But this, once again, creates a lot of separation. We talk about on the channel utilizing our harmonies or our background vocals and then widening those so that there's separation and space between the lead vocal and the background vocals. I like to use spatial effects on, my bass lines, the distorted aspects of bass to, give it some more excitement. I like to use spatial effects on the backgrounds to make them more wide, to make them more 3D. And then I also utilize imaging on my stereo bus a lot of times to give us a little bit more width in the highs, the high mids, and once again, keep the lower frequencies anchored so that we've got a more dynamic, a more exciting mix in that way across the stereo field. There's a big misconception out here about creating mixes that are very monocentric for the sake of compatibility, and you've got to be careful about that. You do not want to give up all of that sonic real estate in terms of having a left and a right side in a mix for the sake of compatibility. So you want to be aware of mono. You want your mixes to sound good on mono, but we want our mixes to be exciting, and you need to be utilizing the entire stereo spectrum to give us that more 3D exciting separation. Use stereo delays, use stereo reverbs and spatial effects. We have all of this sonic real estate to use, so you might as well go ahead and dive in and utilize the stereo field. All right, so final point I want to touch on for creating space and separation in your mixes is to be very aware of the limiting and the compression that you're doing on the stereo bus. Okay, so we talked about compression a little bit earlier. We were talking about how you got to be careful. You don't want to be compressing everything across the mix because you're going to flatten the dynamics. Then we have no separation. It's just a boring flat mix, right? So on the stereo bus, the same thing applies. I'm amazed at how surprised a lot of people are when I show them that on my stereo bus, I use very little to, in most cases, no compression on my stereo bus. And that's because I want to utilize the compression on the tracks that need it in the mixing process, but I don't want to lessen all of that separation that we're talking about in this whole video achieving by putting a compressor on the mix bus. Again, it's going to maybe provide you a little bit of glue. That's the point. You just want something to kind of keep things in check, but you don't want to be flattening all that stuff out that we worked for. So for example, I have a vintage compressor on this mix here, and I don't think it's doing much of anything at all. It may just be kissing it, but I'm going to pull the threshold down just so that you all can hear what happens, and it's not pleasant.
Stepped outside and it's fluid. Some hesitate and we knew it, but we ain't gotta overthink through it. They recognize how we do it. Just stepped outside and it's fluid. Got intellect, I'm into it, but we ain't gotta overthink.
So obviously that's a very extreme example, but as I'm pulling it down and we're getting all that compression, you notice that the vocal doesn't stand out as much. All of this leveling that we did so precisely in the mix starts to become less noticeable. There's not as much separation. Be very cautious about using compression on your master bus channel. Now, I do utilize a limiter, and this is once again usually a safety net just to keep me below zero. If you all out there are trying to pump up your masters or your mixes at the final stage and you're relying heavily on a limiter, then you're naturally going to create less separation. You're going to end up with a flatter mix. Maybe it's louder, but it's not going to be as dynamic, and it's certainly not going to be as fun for your listener because it's going to lack depth. All right, y'all. So we have unpacked a lot of different aspects for creating space and separation in your mixes. I'm sure these are things that you all are familiar with or that you have heard about. And the more that you practice them, the more that you're applying these concepts that we touched on, you're going to get a feel for how powerful all this stuff is in creating a more dynamic, more exciting mix. And it's going to separate you, no pun intended, from the rest out here in terms of your quality and in terms of the listener experience. So if you learned anything in the video, please like, subscribe, and consider sharing. We'll talk to you soon.
It's so fluid how you stay